Now let's just open
Mrs. Thurnbury, I'm sorry. Is it possible for you to put your headset on? Is it around you?
Okay.
That way you will be heard clearly. Thank you.
Right. Let's see if you can hear me now. How's that? Is that better?
Sure. It's much better. Okay. You can share your presentation now. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Share. Okay. We're going to talk about methods, and I'm just going to start by inviting you to look at some pictures of methods, and hopefully, if this works, I want you to identify the method, and I want you to go into the Mentimeter, which website on your phone or your computer. Oktay is going to give you the link, I think, if this is working. And when I show you the picture, or when you see the picture on your screen, I want you to identify, there's a choice of 9 different methods. I want you to identify the method that you think the picture represents. Now, I'm not entirely sure that this is working, but Oktay, can you? Yes, there's the code. Menti.com, use the code 511426. Yeah, and you'll see that there is a picture of a method. In fact, you can see it there in the screen. When you get into menti.com and use that code, then can you choose the method that's represented? Okay, we'll wait a minute or two to people to get on board. And then we'll start to see, hopefully, some results. So that's the picture of the method. You can see it there at the back of the screen, and you can also see it on the app, the Menti.com app. So when you've downloaded that, have a look at the different options. There's 9 different options, and then decide which one it is. I'm assuming that this is working satisfactorily, and any minute now we're going to see some, here we go. Yes. Okay, there is a strong preference, a very strong preference for audiolingualism. And I think, in fact, this wins outright. There are 1 or 2 other methods being identified, but the majority by far is for audiolingualism. And why is that? I mean, what is it about this picture that is so emblematic of audiolingualism? Well, of course, it's the language laboratory. And the language laboratory was the educational technology of its time. It was ideal for doing what audiolingualism was famous for, which was the chief method of its whole approach, which was to practice different grammatical patterns or structures or whatever you want to call them, and to do this repeatedly until they became habituated. So the language laboratory was the ideal place to do this. People could sit working away, repeating, getting feedback from the machine or from the teacher who would be sitting at the front of the room listening in. And of course, this was, as I say, this sort of defining technique or methodology associated with audiolingualism. Okay, good. Let's move on to the next picture then, which will come up now. And again, see if you can identify the method I love this picture. You see there's three students with the teacher with the tie in the middle, and it's quite clear that they are jumping. And the caption of this picture is something like, if I remember, the boys and the adult, that's the teacher, the adult model, jumped when they heard the command tobe. Tobe is Japanese for jump. So this is a class of Japanese. And yeah, there we go. The pink bar shooting ahead of all the opposition. Total physical response. And so, I mean, that it's the label is on the box. I mean, it's total physical response. The students are responding with their total body to the instructions in the target language, which in this case is Japanese. And if you remember, TPR, or total physical response, is one of those methods that kind of emerged in the United States principally in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, 80s, to kind of fill the gap that was created when audiolingualism kind of was in its decline. And there was that flurry of methods associated with holistic learning in particular. That's whole body learning, which we now have perhaps borrowed from rather than used exclusively, but it was very popular in its time. Okay, let's go to number 3 now, and this is the third method that you'll see a picture of. And again, I want you to choose from the list of options. So there's a picture, a photograph of a class. You can see that the students have paired off. They're facing each other, and they have some kind of visual worksheet. Now, there's less consensus about this one. Some of you have gone for audiolingualism. I can see there's evidence coming in quite strongly for the communicative approach, but there's some who are guessing that this is perhaps task-based learning. And I'll explain later on that there's in a sense, you're both right, because task-based learning, if you like, is a kind of a strong form of communicative language learning. I'll come back to that point. But yeah, I think communicative language teaching, or the communicative approach, is winning here. And the reason why is because what you've got here is another one of those emblematic activities associated with this particular method, which is the information gap activity. We've got students have got pictures. They've got the same picture, and one of them chooses a face. I think there's in the worksheet here, chooses a face and describes it to their partner. Their partner has to guess which face is being described. So there's a real information gap here, which has to be bridged through communication. Fantastic. Okay, so that was just a warmer. Let's go back to the presentation. And I'm going to show you a couple more photos from my collection of different methods. Just let's open this. Okay. So there was the audiolingualism. There was the total physical response. There is the communicative approach. Here's another one. Again, another one of these sometimes called fringe methods that emerged in the 1970s, 60s, 70s. In this case, it emerged in Bulgaria, and it's called Suggestopedia. So you have the teacher reading a text to the students where they're listening in conditions of maximum relaxation, so that they are eminently suggestible. So it's a kind of hypnotic approach that was, as I say, developed within the humanist scheme of things, and is hardly practiced very much nowadays. And this one I will show, and I'll come back again to talking about, here's a group of students working possibly on some kind of project together. The teacher is literally in the background. And so what this to me represents is task-based language teaching, or project-based language teaching, or activity-based language teaching. I will come back to that. So you see, these are all different what methods, let's move on to defining what a method is. And here's as good a definition as any, which comes from David Noonan. And he says simply that a method is a single set of procedures which teachers are to follow in the classroom, a single set of procedures. And the operative word there is single, and the other operative word is follow. The teachers follow this. They are obliged to adopt the procedures that the method has is promoting. And he goes on to say that methods are usually based on a set of beliefs about the nature of language and learning. And it's because these beliefs change over time that, of course, methods change over time. That the beliefs that underpin an approach like audiolingualism are no longer the beliefs that underpin language learning now, the idea that language is some kind of habit formation. Nevertheless, the concept of method has been criticized consistently over the years, going way back here to 1967. A writer on methods said that he says that much of the field of language method has become a matter of opinion rather than of fact. It is a matter of beliefs rather than facts, rather than research, rather than evidence. And he goes on to say it's not surprising that feelings run high in these matters, and the word method means so little and so much. So even way back in 1967, before most of you were born, people were getting hot and bothered by the notion of method. They were arguing about it because there's a sense that it was all about opinions rather than facts. And a little bit later, in 1983, H.H. Stern made the point that even then, several developments indicate a shift in language teaching pedagogy away from the single method concept as the main approach to language teaching. In other words, the idea of there being a single method was becoming questioned. And one of the reasons behind that, of course, is because language teaching takes place in so many different kinds of contexts, with so many different kinds of students and teachers, that no single method is going to serve all those different variables. And that, of course, led us to the notion that maybe there is no best method at all. And in 1994, Kumaramadevalu proposed that we've gone beyond the concept of method and we're in the post-method condition. And yeah, maybe we are. Maybe we have moved on. But when you Google method or language teaching method, it's amazing how many hits you get. I mean, there are so many people promoting what they call a method. So here's some examples I've taken randomly from the internet. I've removed the name of the method, but these are promotional videos or websites that are selling a particular technique for teaching languages. So developed and used over years in the classroom, the da-da-da method has shown phenomenal success, or our approach, the method, is based on research about blah, 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 or the software is built around a concept called dynamic immersion, and so on, so on, so on. So you've got the word method comes up again and again. And in a survey that a researcher did in 2007 of teachers, of actual practicing teachers, he asked them, do you think methods are dead? Do you embrace the concept of method? And he found, in fact, that for practicing teachers, the idea of method is not dead. Teachers seem to be aware of both the usefulness of methods and also the need to go beyond them. So he was arguing, in fact, that the concept that there is no method has perhaps is a theoretical construct, but it doesn't necessarily equate with what teachers think. So in a sense, we seem to be going around constantly in circles. We start off with methods, and then there's no one method, and then we were in the post method, and there's no method at all, and then we're back to talking about methods again. And I think there's a reason for this, and I think the people who write about methods, like for example Jack Richards and Ted Rogers and their Cambridge book, which is now in the 3rd edition and doesn't look like it's going to go away, they argue that people are interested, teachers are interested in methods, not because they have to follow them blindly, but because they give them kind of recipes, techniques, procedures that they can draw on as they craft their own particular methodology. So they said methods can be studied not as prescriptions for how to teach, but as a source of well-used practices. A source of well-used practices is a kind of resource, if you like, which teachers can adapt or implement based on their own needs. And that's a point that I will come back to near the end. So the idea then that methods haven't gone away, that they offer and I think this is particularly the case for new teachers starting out, who badly need a set of procedures that they can rely on, that have been tried and tested, even if they have been discredited by some theoreticians or researchers. They at least offer something that somebody has done at some time which conceivably worked. So people, as I say, have been writing books about methods, and they still are, and I've written one, and this is the promotion on the part of Cambridge, my sponsors. Thank you, Cambridge, for this book that came out a couple of years ago. And I want to pick from this book 7 methods that I've written about that I kind of like for various reasons, which I hope will come clear. So these are my 7 favorite methods. And this is number 1. Now, this is really, I mean, who's heard of this? This came out in the 19th century. A man called Thomas Prendergast. He was a civil servant in India. He learned a number of languages in the subcontinent. And from that experience of learning these languages, he developed in his retirement what he called the mastery system. And the thing mastery system was that he was convinced that you don't learn language by doing grammar translation activities, as was the practice at the time, but you learn it by, well, we'll see how you learn it. He wrote a book called Mastery of Languages, and in that book he said things like, you know, illiterate people who can't read or write, and children who can't read and write, they acquire the power of speaking with fluency, and they acquire second languages as well as first language. And why? Because they learn a few practical sentences, and then he says by ringing the changes on them. And I'll explain what this means in a second. But he's very convinced that it's all about learning sentences and by using your memory, not by logical reasoning, not by working things out using the rules of grammar. He was very, very anti-grammar. So what he did, he devised a system whereby he had these sentences that he had contrived. And these sentences, nowadays, they look a little bit old-fashioned and perhaps slightly inauthentic. For example, this is from his book, "Why did you not ask him to come with 2 or 3 of his friends to see my brother's gardens?" And so what he did, he would take a sentence like that and he would number every word in the sentence. And I don't expect you to be able to see this very clearly, but this is his system. So you've got along the top 2 sentences. "His servant saw your friend's new bag near our house. Her cousins found my sister's little book in their carriage." Every word is numbered. And then by changing the order of the numbers, you can create all sorts of sentences. And that massive, dense piece of text there that you see are all the different combinations of those words. So what he was trying to get students to do is play around with the structure of sentences using a few basic words to memorize as many possible sentences as possible. Not to learn the grammar of these sentences, but to memorize the different combinations. That's what he meant by ringing the changes. And we see something that's sort of similar here to more recent techniques or learning tools, like, for example, what you've got here associated with audiolingualism, of course, is the pattern practice substitution table. So you've got a table which displays the structure of a particular form, which is not named necessarily, and all the different manipulations that you can do. How does one get in? How do you go about it? How do people know that, etc.? So all these different combinations are what you're meant to practice. So that was, in a sense, not dissimilar from Prendergast's method. And, it kind of worked for a lot of people. It certainly still works for a lot of people. When you think about it, those of you who may be familiar with Duolingo, which is a language learning app, which is enormously popular, not least because it's free, but it does exactly the same things. It plays around with words, so you produce sentences which are not very authentic, like this one, learning Gaelic. The musician played the fiddle, but he died. Or this is learning German. Good morning, spider. Goodbye, fly. Or it does be snowing in the month of January, another Gaelic one. Or an eggplant is not a purple banana in French. Or my favorite, the hamster talks Romanian. These are kinds of sentences that you get on Duolingo. Nobody's pretending that they're real sentences, but they offer an opportunity to practice, to ring the changes on all the different things. And the other thing that Prendergast was very clear about was that if you have a minimal vocabulary of about, he said, 200 words, then you have all the equipment you need for all the syntactical constructions of the grammatical constructions of the language. If you can, when a child can employ 200 words of a foreign language, he possesses a practical knowledge of all the syntactical constructions and of all the foreign sounds. So he devised himself lists of the most common words, or what he thought were the most common words. Now, this is an idea that's come full circle, as we know. Now we have data which tells us what the most common words are, and we not only know that some of these very common words are very much the heart and soul of the English language. I'm thinking of auxiliary verbs, particularly of prepositions, of articles and things like that. And John Sinclair said in 1991 that learners would do well to learn the common words of the language very thoroughly, the common words of the language, because they carry the main patterns of the language. And this is exactly the kind of, really, this is a recapitulation of the idea between Prendergast's mastery system. Let's move on to number 2 of my favorite systems, and this is methods. This is the oral method. This man I have enormous respect for. His name was Harold Palmer, and he worked through the 20th century, mainly in Japan, and he was an amazingly versatile man, wrote grammars, wrote textbooks, contributed to dictionaries, and was also a brilliant thinker. And he built on the work that had been done by people like Berlitz on the direct method. Remember, the direct method was where you are kind of plunged into the language and you do not use translation. And his books, Palmer's books, have a lot of these kind of practice activities that you see like this, where the teacher demonstrates directly using his own body. This is my head, that is your head. Is this my head? Is this your head? Is this my head or your head? Is this my, again, we're not in the area of authentic language use. What we're in is repeated combinations, ringing the changes, if you like, on different patterns. And we get this taken to ridiculous extent in other books of the period, where you have conversations like this. That is your mouth. This is my mouth. My hand is on my knee. Your finger is on your arm. You get a little bit of total physical response here, you can see, because it's all about embodiment in a sense, using what you can see in the classroom, in this case, your body, to demonstrate different grammatical combinations of basic vocabulary. Now we can ridicule this and say that nobody says things like your finger is on my nose. That wasn't a major concern of the direct method teachers. Nevertheless, Palmer himself, when he was asked, what is it? What is the key to proficiency in a second language? What is the most fundamental guiding principle? He said this: memorize perfectly the largest number of common and useful word groups. That is to say, gaining access to fluency in a second language is all about knowing, having available a memorized store of common, that is to say, high frequency word groups. That is to say, not individual words, but word groups, common expressions, formulaic expressions, chunks, we can call them, whatever. Now, this was in 1925. And that's pretty amazing, because everything we know about fluency now tends to reinforce the view that, yes, you achieve fluency in a second language if you have a memorized store of chunks. So people like Paulian Sider said in 2000, it is knowledge of conventional expressions more than anything that gives speakers the means to escape from the one clause at a time constraint. That is the key to native-like fluency. If you've got a memorized library, if you like, of phrases, you are less, there's less requirement to build up every utterance, word by word, clause by clause. And this is other writers, researchers into second language acquisition, not only does it give you fluency, but it may in fact give you grammar as well, without having to teach grammar or learn grammar. So Rod Ellis and Shintani say, in a summary of recent research, say this is the prevailing view. The prevailing view now is that learners unpack the parts that comprise a sequence, that is a chunk. They kind of unpack it. They unpack it mentally and unconsciously, and in this way discover the second language grammar. In other words, these formulaic sequences, these chunks, serve as a kind of what they call starter pack from which grammar is generated. Now, this certainly seems to happen in first language. It's still debatable whether it happens in second language learning, and particularly in adult second language learning, but it is a very powerful concept. And so it's in a sense, it was predated by people like working on the oral method, learning all these patterns, repeating them, memorizing and memorizing, and becoming fluent. Let's move on to number 3. How are we doing for time? The reading method. The reading method, you probably, again, you may well not have heard it. It came out in the United States in the 1930s in this book. And basically the problem was for students at school in the United States at the time who were learning modern foreign languages like French, Spanish, Russian, or whatever, were making very, very, very slow progress. It was very frustrating. They were just not getting anywhere in the 2 or 3 years that they had to learn these languages at only 2 or 3 lessons a week, perhaps. And so the author of this report said, hang on, look, I think we're just being too ambitious. There's no way we can get students up to fluency in 2 years with 2 or 3 lessons a week. Let's lower the bar or move the goalposts nearer, and let's say, forget about speaking, forget about listening even, just let's focus on reading. If we can get learners reading in the foreign language, they are well placed then to develop the language skills autonomously should they need to, through contact, for example, with speakers of the language. So this was Coleman's thesis, that the objectives of their approach, the reading method, was the ability to read the foreign language with moderate ease and with enjoyment for recreative and for vocational purposes, to read. And this was an idea that was picked up by a number of other writers at the time. Michael West was another British teacher and methodologist. And he did some research into reading, and he concluded that learning to read a language before learning to speak, it has the advantage that when the pupil begins to speak, he possesses some general idea of the form of the language and some sense of right or wrong idiom. In other words, it's not about reading only, but reading as a kind of starter pack, if you like, again, to use that expression, as a way into the language through reading. And we might add listening there now too, of course. Now, that was in 1937. Does this ring any bells? Has anybody been saying this more recently, that it's all about comprehension, comprehension, comprehension? Yes, of course. Our good friend Stephen Krashen, who from the 1980s was saying much the same thing. And he still says it. And this book that came out a few years ago now, he says, and this is about not just in the second language, but also first language literacy. He's a great advocate of libraries, for example, not closing them all. Because reading is a powerful means of developing reading comprehension ability. Obviously, you get better comprehension, but also writing. It impacts on writing, vocabulary, grammar, spelling. And not only that, it's pleasant and it promotes cognitive development, improves our brain skills, our mental capacity, and it lowers fear of writing apprehension. So there's lots of evidence that suggests that, well, maybe the reading method, it was the best bet at the time, and maybe there was a lot to be said for it, and maybe there still is something to be said for the idea of starting off with comprehension. Let's move on. Number 4. Ooh, we're halfway through. CLL, what does that stand for? It's not CLIL. It's not about content and language integrated learning. It's one of these methods that we associate now when we look at the history of methods with total physical response and Suggestopedia. It stands for community, not communicative, but community language learning, sometimes called counseling language learning, because it was developed out of counseling therapy. The architect of the method was himself a therapist, and the idea was it's like group therapy. Students sit in groups. This is the bird's eye view of what's going on. So they are communicating in the foreign language to others in the group. How are they doing that? They're getting help from the teacher, who's sort of metaphorically sitting on their shoulder, whispering in their ear. So when they want to say something, they say, I want to say something to the group, like, what did you do at the weekend? And the teacher says, well, in German, you say blah, 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 blah. Or in English, you say blah, blah, whatever it is, the target language. And then they say it, and then they record it having been said, and then they pass the recording device, whether it was an old-fashioned cassette recorder or now, of course, a phone. They pass it to the person who answers the question, and again, maybe by consulting with the teacher. So the teacher is the kind of black shape that's literally behind the students. So the students are sitting in a group, and it's all about the group. They construct conversations. These are recorded. Then they're played back and transcribed, and then the teacher becomes the traditional teacher at the board, looking at the transcription, explaining things that may be of relevance and use for those particular learners. But the important thing here is that the learners decide what they want to say. There's no topic that's preset. There's no task that's preset. There's no grammar that's preset. The learners decide what they want to say, that they want to hear answers to. Interesting stuff, chat, conversation, and so on. And then the teacher provides the language that they need to do that. And it's all about the group. As one person who experienced this said, we're just beginning to realize that it's up to us. This is the students speaking. It is up to us. It's up to the group to decide how you want to learn. It comes from the group, and the group decides to do it. This, to me, was the biggest thing, she says, this student. And I think that's very important. And people who've experienced this often say, yes, we got on really well as a group, and the language kind of took off because we wanted to get to know each other better. It was a group thing. And as people have said subsequently, Michael Breen, basically, the language you learn in the classroom is a communal product. It's a communal product derived through a jointly constructed process. It's not something that comes from the teacher, but it comes from interaction within the group. And what's interesting is that Curran, who developed this idea, foresaw perhaps the idea of online learning, that this could be done with the teacher actually physically absent, with the students working in the group. So on the left, you have the students working in the group. Then you have the teacher in another room with a phone connection or some kind of electronic connection. This was in 1983. This is way before online learning. But you can see that this could work in online learning. So you've got the students in a chat room talking to each other, and then they've got contact through a direct chat with the teacher, and they can ask the teacher, how do I say, how do I say, how do I say? The teacher tells them, and they type it into the chat box so that the other students can read it, and they build up this conversation. The beauty of that is you don't have to transcribe it because it's all there in the text chat, and the teacher can come back into the room if you like, and then give them some kind of instruction, point out features of the language. So I think this is kind of interesting in the context of online learning, which everybody's, of course, talking about right now. Okay, we're moving through Crazy English. You must have heard of this. This developed in China in the 1990s, maybe, or even later. This man called Li Yang, who had very bad experience learning English at school, so he developed this approach called Crazy English, where you just went crazy. He would get up and he would have the whole classroom and then the whole auditorium and then sometimes whole football stadiums chanting things like, I am not ashamed of my bad English. There they are. Look at them. This is a whole football stadium of people chanting along. He's drilling them in different expressions, and they're losing their inhibitions because they're all together and they're not being corrected. They're not being judged. This is what he was so keen about. But it was not a new idea in some senses. There's another man in the States back in the 70s called John Rassias who did similar things in his classrooms. He would dress up, he would throw things at the students, he would basically perform, and he carried on doing that until his recent death. And so this idea was that if you disinhibit the learners, if you take the stress out of learning, you'll make learning possible. And you have to not be afraid of making mistakes. So this was Li Yang in an interview. He said, you have to make a lot of mistakes. You have to be laughed at by a lot of people when you're learning a second language. But that doesn't matter because your future is totally different from other people's futures. It doesn't matter. Your trajectory as a learner is your trajectory, and you should not be put off by what other people are capable of doing or what you think you are incapable of. And John Rassias said a similar kind of thing. Have the courage to be bad, to make mistakes, but the important thing is to speak. Okay, finally. Oh no, 6. How many have we got? 7. Will we make it? Yes, I think we will. 6. Task-based language teaching. Eski's getting worried that I'm going to go on and on, but Eski, I'm not. I'm coming to the end now. Task-based language teaching. You know about task-based language teaching. Some of you identified the communicative approach to task-based language teaching, and they're basically much of the same thing. If you remember back at the beginning of the communicative approach, this is how people taught pre-communicatively. That's the top circle. They would present, they would drill, they would practice, and they would present something else. So today is Tuesday. We're going to do the present perfect continuous. Drill, 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 repeat, repeat, practice, 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 practice. Now today is Wednesday. We're going to do the third conditional. Drill, 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 drill. Okay, and that was the kind of reigning method at the time. The communicative approach said, no. Language learning and language use start with meanings, not with the present perfect continuous. We start wanting to say something. So let's get the students to say something or to write something, but to do something, to produce, to communicate. So the second cycle there is what is the communicative one. Communicate as far as possible. Do what you can. Here's a task. Try and do it. Explain how you get to work in the morning. Just tell your partner that. Just try. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to give you some language which will help you to do that again, because I've noticed you didn't know some prepositions, or you were there was some vocabulary there that you had trouble accessing. And then we might practice and then go back and then communicate again. The cycle goes around. So that was the communicative cycle, if you like. And it's the task-based cycle as well. Because, as Dr. Allwright said at the same time, if communication is the aim, then it should be the major element in the process. If communication is the aim of language teaching, then let's start with communication and finish with communication. And on the subject of task-based learning, I just wanted to share with you a longer quote that I wrote, contrasting again the two cycles, if you like. So a presentation approach, that is what we call PPP, present, practice, produce, is based on the premise that there is something that the learners don't know, like the third conditional. And the approach attempts to fill these holes in their knowledge. So it's based on a kind of deficit view of language. There's something that you don't know, learners, something I know because I'm the teacher, and I'm going to give you my knowledge, and you're going to be eternally grateful. A task-based approach, on the other hand, starts from the assumption that there is something that the learners can do. Everybody can do something, even if they just use their hands, and it attempts to empower them with the means to do this more effectively. So it's an empowering methodology. And it's one also that I would argue is very appropriate for online learning. Okay, what's the seventh method? The seventh method is your method, and this is the cheesy bit. Your method, because there's no one method that works. The best method is the method that you devise for your particular context, your particular students, and that is consistent with your particular beliefs and your experience. And what you will do possibly is use bits and pieces of these different methods to construct a method which you feel is plausible. Plausible. Yeah, I'll come back to that word in a minute. It's an eclectic approach. As Diane Larson Freeman says, when teachers pick and choose from among methods, their practice is said to be eclectic. But remember that methods are coherent combinations of techniques and principles. Teachers who have a consistent philosophy and pick in accordance with it could be said to be practicing principled eclecticism, not any old this, that, and the other, but it's principled. So there are my 7 methods. These are the takeaways, and in my book, which I'm going to show you now, I talk about the positive things of all these methods. They have something to teach us. The mastery system says that manipulation of formal elements is good. The oral method says memorization of chunks is good. People still agree with that. The reading method, comprehensive input, is good. Community collaborative learning is good. Crazy English stress reduction is good. Task-based language teaching, meaning-driven learning is good. And your method is context-sensitive, sensitive to your context, and it gives you a sense, it's based on a sense of plausibility, because perhaps the best method, says Prabhu, it varies from one teacher to another, but only in the sense that it is best for each teacher to operate with his or her own sense of plausibility at any given time. That is to say, it must fit your beliefs, your context, your situation, your experience, etc. And if you believe in it, it will work. And I think that's the final message I want to get across. Jane Spiro says in a book on methodology, the critical factor in success is the commitment and belief of the teacher in the methods he or she is using. You're not going to believe in a method or do it well if you don't believe in its basic principles. So you've got to believe in it. And you also got to reflect on it as you go along and adapt it and change it. Yeah. So it's the commitment and belief of the teacher and the continuing reflection of the teacher as to whether these methods are making a positive difference. Thank you. And Ezgi, I'll hand over to you. Yeah. I don't know whether we've got any time for questions.
Mr. Thurnbury, I am one of your biggest, fans. I can watch you, and I'm sure all the attendants from all around the world can watch you for hours and hours, but we are running out of time. So now I selected 2 questions, very quick questions. Mm-hmm. And one of them is from the UK, probably Bade. Which method is more engaging for young learners on remote teaching? She goes.
Great question. I think, as I said, for remote teaching generally, of those methods, it's what both engaging and also what is practicable, what works given the technology, etc. Things, I mean, I think, as I said, you know, when students are constructing conversations together using chat programs, that's perfectly legitimate. And I think any age group can get a lot of, if they're socializing using basic technology, even if it's WhatsApp, then that's fantastic, because we forget at our peril the social side of language learning. And that's as true for children as it is for adults. I think the reading method, things like that, things that students can do offline before or after class, that's fantastic. There's lots of wonderful material, of course, for reading and for listening and for watching for video. So giving them a menu of things to look at, then they come back to class and talk about them. Don't do the reading in class, do it outside of class. And task-based language teaching, if you think of task-based language teaching, it's not as task, but as project-based language teaching, of doing a project about my pet, for example, of assembling together a display using photos and so on that they do, working together collaboratively online or just individually, and then presenting it to the rest of the class, show and tell kind of thing. That's fantastic, and it's feasible and it's possible online just as much as it is in the classroom. So it's a kind of it's a form of task-based learning.
Mr. Thurnbury, I mean, we have a shortage of time, so it was such a pleasure for me to be a part of your speech. You chose 7 methods that embody sound principles of methodology and suggest that methods are not, as sometimes claimed, dead. Knowing theories for me and for my colleagues, knowing theories is essential as it is like a compass, you know. It helps teachers to find their right path so that they can use eclectic methods. I mean, we appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm sure thousands of teachers benefited from the things you shared with us today. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Stay home.
Thank you very much.
Stay healthy in Spain, you know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ezgi. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Dear participants, as you all know, we have one more speaker who is from the United States. I can feel your heartbeats and the program is going on. Before Dr. Sheen's presentation, enjoy your short break. Hang on tight.